What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 predictions for the upcoming 2025 college football season. Up next is the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Minnesota coming off a pretty solid season last year in 2024, going 8-5 overall in 2024 as well. So that was obviously not a surprise. This Minnesota team, every year it seems like they're always one of the more consistent programs in the Big Ten. They're not like a dark horse potential, type team, and they don't really have that talented roster, but they're a decent team and a solid team every year that is well coached, and that's just really the thing about this Minnesota team. My thoughts on this team before we get into the prediction for 2025, I think they'll be solid once again. I think they're going to be pretty decent on both sides of the football. I mean, the only concern that maybe I would have is probably the defensive line. They have some question marks there with the depth and everything. Secondary could be a little bit of concern, but I think this Minnesota team will be just fine, and I think offensively they'll be decent on that side of the football. They're not going to be an explosive offense, let's just face it that way, but they do have a decent offense and everything, and this is a Minnesota team, again, led by P.J. Fleck as the head coach. They are just consistent, so let's now get to the schedule for 2025. This is their schedule coming up for this upcoming season, and again, Minnesota was 8-5 last year in 2024, so let's go game by game, and I'll give you my official prediction for this Minnesota football team for 2025. They're going to start the things off with Buffalo here on August 28th. This game will be on a Thursday, it looks like. So yeah, they will open things up on a Thursday against Buffalo. Their first two games are actually pretty easy. They play Buffalo and Northwestern State, so I think they take care of business in both of these games. Buffalo is a Group of 5 team out of the MAC, and then Northwestern State, they're an FCS team. So I think the difference between these two teams, I think Buffalo, will keep Minnesota probably from scoring like over 40 points, and I think Northwestern State's probably going to be a game where they at least win by 40 or even like 50 points. So I think that's the difference here between these two games, but I think the Golden Gophers get the win here. So I'm going to say that Minnesota, they start off 2-0 in 2025, and then they go on the road to play California on September the 13th. So they do have to travel out west here, which is definitely going to be a pretty tough matchup here for Minnesota. Although I think these two teams are fairly even. Both of these teams are going to want to run the football in this game. I think it's going to be one of those defensive battles. I wouldn't be surprised maybe if Minnesota did win this game, but when you travel out west and everything from a long ways from your hometown, that's really going to give, some teams some trouble. Again, playing at California, that's a pretty tough place to play. And again, just traveling out west, that's going to be pretty tough here on Minnesota with the travel and everything. I think it will be a close game, though. I wouldn't be surprised, again, if Minnesota will win this game. California did lose their starting quarterback, so maybe they did lose. Maybe they, have some question marks at that quarterback position, but this will be a pretty solid California team, in my opinion. And again, I think it really does come down to whoever has the better running game. But I think home field advantage is going to be the difference. And also, playing on the road at Cal, that really is a tough place to play, and again, traveling out west is just going to probably give Minnesota a little bit of trouble. So I think Minnesota loses a close game here to Cal, so I got them dropping to 2-1, and they actually get their first bye week before jumping into Big Ten play the rest of the way. I think this is actually a pretty good spot for the first bye week because really you got a home game against Rutgers here, another team that's going to want to run the football basically, but you also get 2 weeks to recover after that, travel to California and everything, and it does give you a break before playing your first Big Ten conference game. Again, Rutgers going to be a team that's going to want to run the football. They'll be a solid team this year. They're kind of well coached, under their head coach. They made a bowl game in the last 2 years, and I think this is a pretty even matchup, in my opinion. I think these are two really even running teams. Passing game probably would give the advantage to Rutgers in this game, but I think Minnesota playing at home is going to get it done, plus the bye week does help them out, and I think they get the win here over Rutgers in a pretty close game, low-scoring defensive game. But I think the running game will be the difference here for Minnesota, basically in the second half. So I got Minnesota getting their third win of the season. That puts them at 3-1, and then they play on the road at Ohio State on October the 4th. I don't really expect this one to be close at all. The Buckeyes are just too talented. They're going to have a pretty good offense full of great wide receivers. Defensively, they might take a little bit of a step back on that defensive side of the football, so maybe Minnesota can score in this game with their running game, but still, Ohio State is just too dangerous, and I think Minnesota will fall in this game. I don't think it will be a blowout, though. I think it probably will be a 17-point win, though, for Ohio State, and I got them losing this game, so that drops Minnesota now to 3-2. And then they play Purdue at home on October the 11th. Obviously, Barry Odom taking over as the Boilermakers head coach. We really don't know how good this Purdue team is going to be, obviously, because of a new roster and a lot of turnover from last year. And yeah, that just has me concerned here for for Purdue, obviously. And also, Minnesota's playing at home, so I do expect Minnesota to come in here, especially after a loss to Ohio State, to rebound. Although they could probably have a pretty tough time in the first quarter because they may be a little bit beat up after that loss to Ohio State from last week. But I think Minnesota does take care of business. This might be the easiest win on their entire schedule against the Big Ten opponents. So I got Minnesota improving to 4-2, and then they play another home game against Nebraska on October the 18th. Oh boy, this is a tough one here for me to predict. I think Nebraska is going to be a pretty good team this year in 2025. Dylan Raiola is back at quarterback. We saw how good he was at times and then also kind of bad at times, but I think he has a chance to be one of the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten. I mean, this year he's going to be a sophomore, so he does have that experience as the quarterback for the Cornhuskers, and Matt Rule is a pretty good coach, but I think Minnesota, the game plan for them in this one will definitely be running the football and wasting the clock down, keeping that Nebraska offense off the field. And I also think their defense will have a pretty good day. I think it's one of those games where Nebraska keeps it close, but then they start to blow it. And I think that's one of those close games that they lose. So I think Minnesota actually beats Nebraska. I don't really want to call it an upset, but I think the Golden Gophers get it done. And it's also kind of tough to go against Minnesota when they're playing at home. But I got Minnesota getting the win, so that puts them now at 5-2 before playing a road game at Iowa on October the 25th. I just did my Iowa video from yesterday, and I already picked the Hawkeyes to win this game. I think this is a pretty even matchup. I think both teams will want to run the football here in this game. There's a lot of depth concerns about the Hawkeyes. Not a ton of depth on this team, but I talked about in that video. There was one game where I think Iowa can definitely win this year. It's definitely this game against Minnesota, so I think Iowa does do it here. I think it is a close game, but I'm going to say that Iowa does beat Minnesota here. Again, I just think it's a pretty even matchup when these two teams just go at it. I know Minnesota beat Iowa on the road a couple years ago, I think it was. I just can't remember, but I think Minnesota, will fall to Iowa here, and I got them falling to 5-3 now. Then they play Michigan State after that at home on November 1st. Michigan State might be a little bit improved from where they were last year. They definitely still have a lot of question marks, and they still have a long ways to go. I mean, I look at this matchup. Minnesota probably is the better team. They're probably the more coached team, and I also think their running game is a lot better than Michigan State, so I think Minnesota actually wins this game, but I think it probably is a close game in the first half, but maybe second half, Minnesota, their run game starts to really wear down Michigan State's defense, and I got Minnesota getting the win, so that gets Minnesota to a bowl game, and that puts them at 6-3, and then they get their second bye week before playing at Oregon on November 15th. This is another game that I don't expect to be all that close. Oregon is just going to be way too good. And also, Dante Moore by this time will be a lot better here for the Ducks as long as he can stay healthy. And yeah, this is a very tough place to play. And also, it's out west, so I don't think Minnesota is going to win this game. This is the second time that they'll travel out west since that California game. And that's going to give Minnesota some trouble. So I think they fall to Oregon here. I think this is probably going to be the biggest loss of the season here, maybe for Minnesota. Maybe it's not, though. Maybe it's not a blowout. Maybe Minnesota runs the football and wastes the clock to really make this a short-scoring game. But I got Minnesota falling to 6-4. And then they play at Northwestern here on November 22nd. So back-to-back road games here in the month of November. You look at this Northwestern team. I have a lot of question marks about this team. I don't know how good this team is going to be. Last year they're coming off a pretty disappointing year. I kind of expect them to bounce back this year, but it's kind of hard to tell how good this team is going going to be. But you look at this matchup, Northwestern, they might not be the better team here. Minnesota is probably the better team, but, after playing out west and everything, and then also kind of getting a little bit beat up after Oregon, I think Minnesota comes in a little bit sloppy in this game, and I think they probably play their worst game of the season, and it probably is against Northwestern. And I think this is a trap game as well, playing on the road. If this one was at home for Minnesota, I would definitely pick them to win this game, but I'm actually going to go with Northwestern here to kind of pull off a slight upset. So I'm going to say that Northwestern gets the win. And like I said, after playing Oregon from last week out west, and then also a little bit beat up, I think that's where Minnesota will come in a little bit sloppy. So I think Minnesota falls in this game, and that drops into 6-5. And then they close things out with Wisconsin at home on November 29th. I have a lot of question marks about this Wisconsin team. Don't know how good this team is going to be. They have a very tough schedule, obviously. I mean, they still got some playmakers on the roster. But, Minnesota, I think after 2 losses in a row, they'll come in fired up for this rivalry game against Wisconsin. I think it is a low-scoring defensive game. I think it does come down to both teams' running games. And I think Minnesota definitely has the better running game. So I'm going to say that Minnesota gets the win here. So I got Minnesota closing out the season with a win over Wisconsin. And I got this team finishing 7-5 this upcoming season in 2025. I think 7-5, 8-4, 6-6, probably the most likely records for this Minnesota team. Again, I don't expect this team to be a dark horse team, but I can definitely see them making it to a bowl game. That's no surprise there. But I can see them probably winning one of these road games. It wouldn't surprise me if they did beat Cal on the road, and they could probably go 8-4. And it also wouldn't surprise me if they beat Northwestern. Maybe they can go 9-3. But I think 7-5, 8-4, and 6-6. Again, the most likely records for this team for 2025. So that's my prediction for the Golden Gophers. Do you guys agree or disagree with this prediction? And give me your prediction for Minnesota down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.